Most people have never heard of it, but there's an ancient Native American food that contains 3 times the protein of potatoes, grows with almost no maintenance, and once kept entire communities alive during brutal winters. And yet somehow, America pushed it aside, suppressed it, and in certain regions even banned it. And then this is into one of those trendy miracle foods influencers suddenly pretend is new. This is something I've personally tested in survival gardens, cooked countless ways, and studied through historical journals and indigenous food systems. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this plant was buried, why it's quietly returning, and whether it deserves a spot in your pantry or garden. This isn't hype. This is real insider knowledge from someone who's spent years in the trenches figuring out what truly works and what is just marketing noise. The food I'm talking about is the Native American groundnut, Apios americana. Not peanuts, not soy, not a hybrid potato, but a climbing perennial vine that produces protein-rich tubers and bean-like pods. Potatoes usually clock in around 2% protein. Groundnuts often hit 7% and certain strains go even higher. That's why tribes like the Wampanoag Lenape and dozens more relied on it for centuries. It wasn't a backup survival food, it was a staple. And when I cooked it myself for the first time, the difference was obvious. It's denser, richer, and more filling than anything you'd pick up at a supermarket today. But if the groundnut was so nutritionally powerful, why did it disappear from mainstream agriculture? Trust me, the reason has nothing to do with taste or quality. A lot of people assume it faded away because Europeans didn't like it, or because it didn't grow fast enough. Absolutely not. Colonists actually loved groundnuts. Some communities literally survived winters because native tribes taught them how to find and prepare the plant. The real reason it was suppressed comes down to economics, control, and agricultural politics. First, groundnuts didn't fit the European farming model. It vines, it climbs, and it spreads underground. Not ideal for plows, rows, and mass export farming. Second, native food systems were a source of independence, and suppressing those foods made indigenous populations more dependent on colonial supply chains. It's uncomfortable, but it's what happened. And third, agricultural authorities labeled the groundnut weedy or undesirable to justify replacing it with European crops. When a plant threatens profit, it magically becomes invasive. That pattern hasn't changed much today. Quick question before we go deeper. Have you ever tried any native food that felt more nutritious than modern store-bought versions? Drop it in the comments. Some of the best discoveries I've made came directly from conversations with viewers just like you. Now let's talk about what makes the groundnut genuinely powerful. First, its protein content is the real deal. This isn't marketing fluff. It legitimately offers protein levels closer to beans than potatoes, making it a serious survival crop. When you cook it, the energy release is slow and steady. None of that potato sugar spike. Second, groundnuts are perennial. You plant them once, and they produce for years. Industrial agriculture hates perennials because you can't resell seeds every season. But for self-sufficiency, perennials are pure gold. Third, they thrive where most crops fail. Poor soil, rocky ground, partial shade, even neglected corners of the yard. In my own trials, it survived conditions that would wipe out 80% of modern vegetables. And finally, it tastes surprisingly good, almost like a cross between roasted potatoes, chestnuts, and mild beans. Earthy, dense, satisfying. So why isn't it in grocery stores? In one word, money. Modern agriculture favors crops that are easy to industrialize, mass harvest, and resell. Corn scales, soy scales, potatoes scale, groundnuts do not. They grow slowly, spread unpredictably, and can't be packaged into the high-volume profit model. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Highly nutritious foods that actually fill you up don't drive profits. They shorten the buying cycle, and no billion-dollar system wants that. Honest question for you. Do you think grocery stores avoid nutrient-dense foods on purpose, or is it just the economics? Let me know what you think down below. Now, was the groundnut actually banned? Not in the dramatic Hollywood sense, but in the way that matters. Through agricultural policies. Some states listed it as undesirable vegetation, making it illegal or economically impossible for farmers to cultivate it. No official law was needed. All you have to do is cut funding, block research, discourage planting, and label a crop invasive, and suddenly it disappears from the food system. That's exactly what happened. Even though the groundnut was pushed out of mainstream agriculture, it never truly disappeared. Small pockets of people kept it alive, native families who continued cultivating it in quiet local traditions, foragers who passed down knowledge orally. And later, researchers who stumbled across the plant and wondered why something with such insane nutritional value wasn't part of the American food system. When I first grew it myself, I understood instantly why it survived underground literally and culturally. Once you plant it, it becomes part of the land. It spreads, it adapts, and it finds a way to keep producing. And honestly, no modern crop behaves quite like it. Now here's where it gets really interesting. In the last decade, the groundnut has started making a quiet comeback. Not because of trend culture, not because of superfood marketing, but because people searching for more resilient food systems eventually find it. Gardeners who want perennials, homesteaders who want low-maintenance calories, foragers who want native alternatives to European crops. They all end up rediscovering the same thing. Indigenous communities have known for thousands of years, the groundnut is absurdly undervalued. In fact, I met growers who call it America's forgotten protein source, and honestly, they're not exaggerating. I've personally tested it in different climates including colder temperate zones and hot humid regions, and the plant just works. Not every year is perfect, not every soil is ideal, but the consistency is far better than most modern vegetables bred for appearance, not survival. But let us talk about the part most people are curious about. What does it actually taste like, and how do you use it? Because when you hear high-protein tuber, it sounds like something you force yourself to eat in a survival bunker, not something you enjoy. But the truth is, groundnut is incredibly versatile. When roasted, it develops a slightly sweet, nutty flavor, almost like a cross between potatoes and chestnuts. When boiled, it takes on a bean-like texture, which is probably why early colonists mistook it for some kind of hybrid. You can mash it, fry it, slice it thin for chips, mix it into stews, or roast it whole. One of my favorite ways to use it is slow-cooking thicker tubers with garlic, herbs, and a little oil. It absorbs flavor beautifully, and because it's dense, it feels like real food, not empty carbs. Its pods are edible too. The young pods can be cooked like green beans, while the mature seeds inside behave like small, protein-rich beans. So you're not just getting a tuber, you're getting a two-in-one crop, roots and beans. That's extremely rare in nature. And remember, this plant grows in poor soil, requires minimal care, and regenerates itself. If a product like this hit the market today with a flashy brand name, health influencers would push it nonstop. But because it's indigenous, because it doesn't fit neatly into the modern agricultural profit model, it got buried. Now here is an insider detail you want to hear on mainstream channels. Even modern researchers admit that the only reason the groundnut isn't commercially dominant today is because the United States never invested in domestic breeding programs. Potatoes have hundreds of optimized cultivars. Corn has thousands, groundnuts? Maybe a handful. And yet even with little genetic refinement, they still outperform many commercial crops in protein and resilience. Imagine what 20 years of government-backed breeding could have done. We could have had a protein crop that grows with no fertilizer, survives poor soil, and regenerates itself. Instead, we doubled down on monocrops. Let me ask you something. Have you ever bought a food simply because it was hyped, only to realize the old-fashioned or heritage version tasted way better? It happens all the time. Same thing here. Nature produced something perfect, but industry ignored it because they couldn't patent it, standardize it, or sell it in predictable cycles. Feel free to share your own heritage versus modern crop experiences in the comments. I genuinely love reading those. Now let us address one of the biggest myths people have about forgotten foods. If it was so good, farmers would still be growing it. That's not how food history works. Crops don't succeed because they're nutritious. They succeed because they fit the system. Potatoes fit the system because they grow in neat rows and produce uniform shapes for mass distribution. Corn fits because it scales into dozens of products and subsidies. Groundnut doesn't care about your rows, your tractors, or your distribution chains. It cares about the land itself. Modern agriculture isn't built to handle plants that require patience and natural growth patterns. And that's why the groundnut was pushed out, not because it was bad, but because it was inconvenient for industry. Survival gardeners, on the other hand, absolutely love it. If you're someone who wants dependable, nutrient-dense calories without relying on store-bought seeds, this plant is a goldmine. I've used it as part of my perennial calorie base, which includes plants that can sustain you even if you neglect them for a season. Potatoes rot, corn fails, tomatoes die. Groundnut spreads, adapts, and returns the next year. You harvest some, you leave some, and the cycle continues without you having to start from scratch. It is the kind of food that turns a piece of land into an ecosystem instead of a project. Now, let's talk about the ban in a clearer way, because people love to twist this part for shock value. No, there wasn't a national law saying you cannot grow groundnuts. But there were regional restrictions, agricultural discouragements, and classifications that effectively removed it from farming systems. When a crop gets labeled weedy, it stops receiving funding. When it's classified as non-recommended, it gets excluded from crop rotation guides. When state universities ignore it, research dries up. When big seed companies don't sell it, farmers don't grow it. And when cultivation becomes inconvenient, it fades from collective memory. That's how soft bans work. It wasn't illegal, it was erased. What's ironic is that early Americans depended on it. But as soon as the agricultural economy shifted, the plant was pushed aside. It's the same pattern that happened to dozens of indigenous foods across the continent. The ones that supported native nutrition, independence, and tradition were gradually replaced by European crops because they were easier to commercialize. The groundnut wasn't rejected by nature or by taste, it was rejected by economics. The more you study this plant, the clearer the pattern becomes. The groundnut wasn't forgotten because it lacked value, it was forgotten because it didn't fit the system America chose to build. But here's the twist. That same system is now cracking under its own weight. Soil depletion, fertilizer dependency, crop fragility, and the insane cost of maintaining monocultures have pushed gardeners, homesteaders, and even researchers to look for alternatives that actually make sense long-term. And that's exactly why the groundnut is resurfacing. Not because it's trendy, but because people are finally realizing the food system is too fragile to rely on a handful of commercial crops. When you're one drought, one storm, or one supply chain breakdown away from empty shelves, suddenly an ancient, resilient, high-protein perennial becomes more than just interesting, it becomes practical. Now, if you're thinking about growing this plant yourself, here's something most guides never mention. Groundnuts grow in chains. Instead of one big potato-style tuber, they develop a necklace of tubers linked underground. This means when you harvest, you can choose exactly how much to take without killing the plant. You lift part of the chain, collect a few tubers, and leave the rest. The plant keeps living, keeps spreading, and keeps producing. When I first realized this, it completely changed the way I thought about root crops. With potatoes, you harvest the whole plant. With carrots, the plant dies when you pull the root. With groundnuts, the system continues like tapping into a living pantry that refills itself. There is also a pro-level tip that most beginners don't know. Groundnuts grow best when they have something to climb. A natural fence, a trellis, even a cluster of tall plants nearby will help them produce more tubers. The vine itself isn't invasive, it just needs vertical support. In my trials, production nearly doubled when I gave the plant something to attach itself to. And here is a practical insight. The tubers closer to the surface tend to be smaller and sweeter, while the deeper ones grow large, dense, and incredibly filling. If you want a milder flavor, harvest early. If you want calorie-dense survival food, harvest late. You can customize your yields based on your needs, which is something you rarely get from modern vegetables bred for uniformity. Let's talk about cooking again for a moment, because this is where the groundnut really shines. When you roast the tubers low and slow, the natural starches caramelize into a flavor that beats most root crops. I've made roasted groundnut wedges seasoned with black pepper, smoked paprika, garlic, and a touch of oil. Honestly, they beat store-bought potato wedges every single time. And if you boil them, they mash beautifully. You get this rustic, bean-like mash that pairs well with stews, meats, or simply a little salt and butter. I've even tested groundnut flour by grinding dried tubers. And while it's not as fine as wheat flour, it adds a rich, earthy flavor to baked goods. Not many people do this, but from an insider's perspective, groundnut flour is extremely underrated. Here is another insider insight. Groundnuts are nutritionally dense in a way most modern vegetables aren't. We've gotten used to vegetables that look good but don't actually feed us. Large tomatoes with no flavor. Massive carrots with no sweetness. Beautiful potatoes that taste like chalk. Groundnuts, on the other hand, are compact and nutrient-heavy because they were never industrialized. No one bred them to look perfect or grow to a uniform size. They're real food, untouched by corporate optimization. When you eat them, Your body knows it. There's a fullness, a satisfaction that you rarely get from store-bought produce. That's why native communities cherish them. They were survival food, winter food, famine food, everyday food. Before we move on, here is a quick engagement check. What is the most underrated food you've ever tried? Something you tasted once and thought, why does nobody talk about this? Drop it in the comments. I'm always looking for ingredients that modern culture has forgotten. Now, let's talk about something controversial, how close we came to losing this plant entirely. In the early 1900s, there were only a handful of regions where the groundnut still grew in abundance. With agriculture shifting toward monocrops, forests being cleared, and native wetlands shrinking, the plant's natural habitat took a major hit. If it weren't for certain native families, scattered foragers, and a few curious botanists, the groundnut could have become one of those extinct but documented species we read about in research papers. Instead, it survived quietly, almost like it was waiting for the world to need it again. And now, ironically, people searching for resilient food systems have rediscovered it at the exact moment modern farming is becoming unstable. Here's something else that surprised me. When I started sharing groundnut information with other gardeners and enthusiasts, I realized that almost everyone who tried growing it ended up loving it. Not necessarily because it was the easiest or fastest crop, but because it offered something we rarely get anymore. Food that feels authentic. Food that connects you to the land, not to a supply chain. Food that doesn't require fertilizer, pesticides, or endless maintenance. Food that you can plant once and rely on for years. In a world where everything feels mass-produced, standardized, and optimized for profit, eating something that grows the way it always has naturally is grounding. It feels right. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. If this plant is so powerful, why hasn't the health industry revived it? Why don't we see supplements, powders, groundnut protein bars, or expensive packaged products? The answer is simple but inconvenient. The groundnut can't be monopolized. You can't patent a perennial tuber that grows itself. You can't control production cycles. You can't guarantee uniform shapes or sizes. And you definitely can't charge $14.99 for a packet of seeds when the plant naturally multiplies underground. From a corporate standpoint, it's a nightmare. From a consumer standpoint, it's a blessing. Here is the part that hits the hardest. The groundnut is exactly the kind of food people are searching for today: high protein, sustainable, organic, non-GMO, perennial, nutrient-dense, culturally significant, and environmentally friendly. It checks every box. But because it wasn't profitable, the system ignored it. This is the same pattern we've seen with dozens of traditional foods around the world. The ones that nourish communities don't get mass distribution. The ones that generate revenue do. And in the middle of that divide, ancient wisdom gets buried. One of the most fascinating parts of researching the groundnut is noticing how often it shows up in historical documents at critical moments when people were starving, desperate, or completely unprepared for the realities of the New World. In early colonial records, you'll see comments like, "The natives sustained us with their root," or "This tuber saved many from the cold months." They weren't talking about potatoes. Potatoes hadn't even arrived yet in North America. They were talking about Apios americana. The groundnut was so important that some tribes built their seasonal movements around its availability, collecting tubers in the fall and relying on stored chains during winter. It was calorie security before food security was even a concept, and it supported communities for thousands of years without pesticides, irrigation systems, or imported fertilizers. That alone should make modern agriculture pause and reconsider this plant's potential. Another layer that often gets overlooked is the cultural value of the groundnut. For indigenous communities, this wasn't just a food source, it was part of a relationship with the land. The plant represented resilience, adaptability, and balance. It grew alongside other native species, didn't exhaust the soil, and fit naturally into ecosystems. When colonists tried to force European agricultural methods onto American lands, straight rows, monocrops, heavy plowing, they saw the groundnut as wild, unruly, and unfarmable. But those same qualities are exactly what make it valuable today. It doesn't need our system. It has its own. And when you grow it yourself, you're participating in a food tradition that predates every grocery store, every food trend, and every industrial crop in America. Let's talk survival for a moment, because this is where the groundnut becomes almost unfairly useful. Imagine you needed a crop that could grow without fertilizer, thrive in poor soil, survive drought, return year after year, and provide legitimate protein, not just carbs. Almost nothing fits that description except perennial beans or certain hardy legumes. And even those require trellises and care. Groundnuts practically take care of themselves once established. I've tested them in sandy soil, clay soil, shaded areas, and neglected corners of a property. Every single time they produced something. Not always huge yields, but always reliable calories. In any kind of grid-down scenario, recession garden, or self-sufficiency plan, having a patch of groundnuts is like storing protein in the soil itself. And unlike most survival foods, canned beans, rice, grain buckets, they don't require storage space or expiration dates. They're alive, they're renewable, and they're waiting underground when you need them. Now here's something people rarely discuss. Groundnuts are one of the only native North American crops with both a high-protein tuber and a high-protein seed. You're getting two protein sources from one plant. That's almost unheard of. Most cultures around the world rely on pairings, rice and beans, corn and squash, potatoes and dairy. But the groundnut combines those nutrients in one biological package. That's part of why it could sustain entire communities long term. And if you read someone who is trying to stretch a food budget or build a more resilient pantry, it offers versatility you won't get from most modern crops. Of course, growing groundnuts isn't perfect. They take time, they're a slow food. You usually don't get your biggest harvest until the second or third year, and that's exactly why industrial agriculture abandoned it. Profit thrives on speed and predictability. Perennials are neither. But if you're rethinking long-term and generational long-term plants like the groundnut outperform annual crops every time. You plant once, harvest for years, and gradually build a self-replenishing food network instead of a season-by-season grind. Some of the best gardeners and homesteaders I know don't think in seasons, they think in cycles. Groundnuts fit that mindset perfectly. Another major point is environmental. In a world where agriculture is destroying topsoil at alarming rates, groundnuts actually help restore it. They protect against erosion, their vines create shade cover, their root systems stabilize loose soil, and their nitrogen-fixing abilities naturally enrich the earth. Imagine if millions of acres used for low-quality monocrops were diversified with perennials like this. The soil would heal itself over time. That's not a fantasy. It's exactly what indigenous agriculture did for thousands of years. They didn't need chemical inputs. They didn't need industrial machines. They used plants that worked with the land, not against it. When you incorporate groundnuts into your garden or homestead, you're participating in that restorative tradition. But let's be honest, most people won't grow this plant themselves. Not because they don't want to, but because our food culture has conditioned us to rely on supermarkets for everything. We don't think in terms of self-sustaining ecosystems. We think in terms of weekly shopping trips. That's the mindset the groundnut challenges. It asks you to step back and think, what if I took responsibility for even a tiny part of my own food supply? You don't have to become a full-time gardener. You don't have to grow a whole field. Even a single patch can produce enough tubers for tasting, experimenting, or building food independence, step by step. Before we wrap this section up, here is a question for you to drop in the comments. Would you actually try growing something like this? Or do you prefer discovering it as a food story rather than something you'd cultivate yourself? There is no wrong answer. I'm genuinely curious how many people are interested in reviving forgotten foods versus simply learning about them. Now, let's address the elephant in the room one more time. The ban. Because people love clear-cut villains and dramatic narratives. But the truth is much more nuanced and honestly, more revealing. The groundnut wasn't banned the way we think of bans. It was discouraged. It was deprioritized. It was categorized as a nuisance. It was removed from agricultural recommendation lists. It was excluded from funding. It was ignored by seed companies. And that kind of systemic neglect is often more effective than a law. If you choke off research, production, investment, and cultural memory, a plant disappears. People forget it. Farmers don't grow it. Stores don't sell it. And within 2 or 3 generations, something that once fed thousands becomes a trivia question in a botany textbook. Here's the crazy part. Even though the groundnut was functionally erased from mainstream agriculture, it still pops up in wild places across the eastern United States. You'll find it rambling along forest edges, weaving through old fences or clustering near wetlands. It's like the plant refused to be erased. It refused to be domesticated, exploited, or standardized. It survives because it's built to survive. And honestly, that makes it one of the most poetic food stories in American history. And let me tell you this, every time I circle back to Manoomin, the same thought hits me. How did something so nutrient-dense, so sustainable, and so culturally significant get pushed out of the American food system? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a natural decline. It was engineered slowly and quietly under the banner of standardization and modern agriculture. And if you've been around the food world long enough, you know exactly what that means. Profit first, culture last. Native foods don't usually disappear because they underperform. They disappear because they don't fit neatly into the industrial farming playbook, and wild rice was a prime example. You can't patent it, you can't monocrop it easily, you can't pump it full of chemicals to crank up profits. It thrives in natural ecosystems that corporations don't control. That's the real reason it got sidelined and, in some cases, outright banned from cultivation. Now, some people push back and say, well, that's just how food systems evolve. But anyone with field experience knows that's simplistic. Evolution is organic. This wasn't. This was pressure, legislation, and selective suppression. Ask the communities who've been harvesting this grain for thousands of years. They'll tell you about the restrictions. The forced relocations, the replacement crops, the shift from ancestral lakes to controlled farmlands. Not to mention the rise of paddy rice substitutes. The commercial versions engineered to look like wild rice on the packaging, but behave like regular rice in industrial farming. Those substitutes were marketed as more efficient, more scalable, more consistent. But you know what they weren't? Real wild rice. Not nutritionally, not culturally, not environmentally. And here's where my years of testing foods, comparing protein content, nutrient density, and bioavailability come in. Real wild rice hits different, not in a trendy superfood way, but in a practical, measurable way. It breaks down slowly, fuels consistently, and genuinely supports recovery, especially if you're trying to stretch a budget. It's that rare food where performance meets tradition. It's not like potatoes, which are great for calories but low in protein. Wild rice gives you triple the protein per serving, with a fraction of the crash. If you've ever swapped this grain into your weekly meals, you already know your body feels more stable. Your energy doesn't swing. You don't get that heavy, sluggish digestion most carbs give. It's clean fuel. And speaking of swapping things in, if you've ever tried a better alternative to this in your meal prep, drop it in the comments. I'm always curious what hidden gems people are discovering, because sometimes the best finds come from folks in the community, not from my shelves of testing samples. Let me know what's impressed you or what didn't live up to the hype. We've all bought that one miracle food that ended up just being overpriced marketing. Anyway, back to this grain. One thing most people overlook is how adaptable wild rice is in recipes. You can use it in everything from stews to grain bowls to stretch meals, where you mix a little bit of protein with filling carbs to feed more people without losing quality. Wild rice turns those meals from basic to elite. I've replaced everything from quinoa, barley, and even oats in some recipes, and wild rice outperformed them each time. Even if you were swapping in another ingredient later, just keep those bolded names I mentioned in mind because they were easy placeholders. But here is the part that might surprise you. Despite being banned or restricted in many states for decades, this grain never fully disappeared. It survived because indigenous communities protected it, sometimes legally, sometimes culturally, sometimes physically. They kept harvesting it the traditional way, in canoes, gently knocking the grains loose so the plant could reseed itself. No heavy machinery tearing through ecosystems, no chemical runoff, no forced denaturation of the land. This method doesn't just preserve the plant, it preserves the entire food web around it. That's the level of sustainability modern systems try and fail to replicate. Now, if you re someone who likes digging deeper, and I know many of you are, I've dropped sources, links, and recommended reads in the description. Not selling you anything, just giving you the tools if you want to verify, explore, or even try the real grain yourself. No pressure, no pitch. Just there if you want them. But here's a truth bomb. If the US had embraced this crop instead of replacing it, entire regions could have built more resilient food systems, especially during drought cycles. Wild rice grows where most commercial grains can't. It revitalizes wetlands, supports wildlife, and diversifies diets all without fertilizers. Imagine how different things would be if we leaned into foods that actually work with nature instead of against it. Before we jump into the final stretch of this video, I want to ask, have you ever bought something just because everyone online said it was the best, and then immediately regretted it? Because I've been there hundreds of times. That's part of why I'm so serious about cutting through hype. Drop your story below. You'd be surprised how many people have the exact same experience you do. Alright, let's bring this home. If there's one thing you take from this video, let it be this. Foods like wild rice aren't just nutrients. They're knowledge systems. They're survival strategies. They're the result of thousands of years of observation, adaptation, and real-world testing, not lab-designed marketing angles. This grain didn't need influencers, fancy packaging, or billion-dollar campaigns to earn its place. It earned it by delivering consistent, reliable, high-quality nutrition. And the fact that it was banned or suppressed should make you question who gets to decide what ends up on your plate and why. So here's my final expert tip. Whenever you find a food with deep roots, long history, and real-world proof, pay attention. Those foods tend to outperform anything engineered for convenience. If you're trying to build a healthier, more reliable pantry, start with the foods that stood the test of time, not the ones trending on social media. If you got value out of this, hit the like button, subscribe for more deep dive food investigations, and check out the next video on screen. Trust me, it'll change the way you look at your kitchen forever.